Ansar Allah has pierced the air defenses of Israel. Ansar Allah celebrates a strike on the Ramon airport. This is near Eilat in southern Israeli occupied territory. And so here you can just see, I'll pull it up really quickly.
Oh my God.
With the reactions from Israelis as they saw the Ramon airport be hit. Now, this comes amid many strikes that Yemen has been launching at Israel via hypersonic ballistic missile or drone. And we had back in May the successful hit of the Ben Gurion airport. And this all comes now, this latest strike comes as Yemen just experienced a decapitation strike where the prime minister of Yemen was killed, as well as several other higher officials affiliated with Ansar Allah. Professor Marandi, Ansar Allah has said that this is just part and parcel, one piece of a total campaign of revenge and, of course, solidarity with Gaza. What is significant about this? Why is it important that this has happened? Because I think there are a lot of aspects to this that people may miss as Israel finds itself mired in an endless war now with Yemen, not least the rest of the region.
Well, one missing piece of the puzzle in the Western narrative and in the regional narrative is that the prime minister who was murdered by the Israeli regime was not a Houthi. He wasn't even Zaidi. He wasn't even from the north. He was from the south. He was Sunni. And that shows that the axis of resistance, it goes far beyond any form of sectarianism or racial hierarchy or religious division, unlike what we're seeing constantly being promoted by Qatari media and other Arabic media and regional media that seeks to divide the region, because they're not with the resistance at all. They're not with the Palestinian people either. They show sympathy for Gaza, but they do everything possible to create division and to prevent the axis of resistance from growing and from becoming more popular and more effective. It's not just Qatar and Saudi Arabia, it's also others as well. But his martyrdom, of course, I think, along with the ministers, was a blow to the axis of resistance, but it's not going to have any real impact on the war. It's, in fact, I think, going to have the opposite, because, again, it shows to the world that this is not a Houthi government. This is not a Zaidi government. This is the Ansarullah-led government, is a government that is inclusive, and the people of Yemen collectively support the resistance and the people of Gaza. And the only segments of Yemen that are hostile are those segments that are funded by the Saudis or the Emiratis or the Qataris or Erdogan. They're the ones who are standing opposed to the government in the south and in certain parts of the country. Otherwise, the country itself is steadfast. We've seen on the birth anniversary of the Prophet's ceremonies across Yemen, the crowds on the streets, the enormous crowds that participated not just in Sana'a but elsewhere. This is in solidarity with the people of Palestine as well. It's not just a religious gathering. This is a political act. So Ansarullah and the Yemeni armed forces, of course, they fired back. They have a sophisticated military defense capability. The people of Yemen are highly educated. And of course, the Iranians are helping them. There's no need to hide that. And they're striking back at the Israeli regime with drones, as we saw recently, and missiles, as we saw earlier. And even those drones and missiles that don't strike their targets, they have their own impact. Because as we all know by now, the Israeli regime's air defenses are very expensive. And firing missiles to down drones or missiles are a big problem for the Israeli regime. But in addition to that, it provides Yemen, and of course Yemen's allies, better information about the Israeli missile defenses. So when they're firing missiles to down these missiles or drones, the Iranians are also gaining knowledge about their capabilities. And as time goes on, of course, Yemen will develop its capabilities even further, and they will continue to harass the Israeli regime. And this will continue as long as the genocide goes on. And we have to keep in mind, Danny, that the Israeli regime has a lot more to lose than Yemen. Yemen has survived 7 years of genocide. In 2015, the Saudis and the Emiratis, with the support of Qatar and Turkey and everyone in the region, and the collective West, they carried out a 7-year genocide. They destroyed everything in the country. They imposed starvation. That Green Beret officer who came out and spoke about the horrors of Gaza, I think it was in his interview with Tucker Carlson. He admitted, he said himself that he was on one of those ships when in the Red Sea, and when they would see these boats that were carrying medicine to Yemen, they dump it into the sea. They dump the medicine into the sea, the food into, because it was a starvation siege. The same thing that they're doing today in Gaza, they were doing to Yemen for 7 years, but they survived. And today they're the pride of the world. But the point is that the Israelis can bomb Yemen, but Yemen has been bombed for years. But every missile that's fired at the Israeli regime, every drone that is fired at the Israeli regime has an impact on their economy, on tourism, on potential investors, on people who are thinking about leaving. And more people should think about leaving because this regime is not going to last. So the impact that each missile that Yemen fires, whether it succeeds or not, or each drone that it fires, whether it succeeds in hitting its target or not, is much greater than the impact of what this brutal, barbaric Israeli regime does to Yemen.
Tel Aviv, the spokespeople of the Israeli regime in Tel Aviv, for example, in Haaretz, have sounded the alarm about the precarious position that Israel finds itself with Ansarallah, with Yemen. With Trump out of the game, Israel is trapped in quotes, private guerrilla war with the Houthis in Yemen. And it cites how the ceasefire back in March of 2025 between the United States and Ansarallah, forced onto the U.S. by Ansarallah, has led Israel to be lonely in its fight with Yemen. And it also cites, Professor Marandi, this article, it also cites how the Arab regimes that you're talking about, the Saudi regime, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, that they have also been forced to enter into this kind of ceasefire. So the question is, Professor Marandi, what makes Israel special then? Because this is a historic pattern, and even those in the Israeli establishment speaking from Tel Aviv in the media are sounding the alarm. What's your reaction to this?
Well, Ansarullah and the Yemeni armed forces, they're causing enormous damage to the Israeli economy. They're not bringing down the economy, but they're causing enormous damage. They've shut down a port, and the continued threat of missiles and drones, especially on an airport, these have further impacts. And Ansarullah, the armed forces of Yemen, the government of Yemen, their focus is on ending the genocide. As long as the genocide continues, then the Israelis are going to be on the receiving end of their missile strikes and drone strikes. Sadly, other countries in the region continue to have diplomatic relations, or they have trade relations, or they have both. And they continue to betray the cause. And I think it's time for people to be more active. They have to force their governments to change the relationship. Just having protests and against the Israeli regime is not enough when your country is doing trade, or when your country has an embassy, or when your country is allowing energy to flow to or from the Israeli regime. That's a betrayal of the Palestinian people. So Ansarullah is focusing on the Israeli regime, and they are making sacrifices. They've lost their prime minister and government ministers in the fight. And of course, the Iranians have. Hezbollah has made huge sacrifices. Probably of all the supporters of Palestine, the greatest sacrifices on the ground have been in Lebanon. But I think it's time for everyone else to take bigger steps and to push harder. The world has changed. We're seeing huge crowds across Western countries and Europe and the United States, Australia, come to the streets, putting pressure on their governments. We see some small policy changes, such as with uh, uh, the governments in Europe. Some of them, at least on a piece of paper, recognizing Palestine. It doesn't mean anything in reality, but it does show the sort of pressure that's being put on them by the public. It shows that that pressure is working. Now, again, recognizing Palestine is not going to change anything. The Holocaust continues, but we see that these regimes are on the back foot. And of course, Spain has also imposed an embargo, I think a military embargo or an embargo on military assets going to the Israeli regime. So everyone has to push harder. We have to make sure that countries in this region, one by one, break off relations. It's disgusting that the regime in Baku is selling cheap oil to Israel, purchasing goods, investing in gas fields as Palestinians are being slaughtered. But that's how it is. It is a dictatorship, but people have to put pressure on the regime. And that's true everywhere else in the region. We all are responsible, every single one of us, wherever we are, to push much harder or as hard as we can under these circumstances. It's almost 2 years now. The world has turned against the regime. We have to take advantage of this shift in public opinion and bring an end to this Holocaust.
Yeah, I want to read a part of this piece I put up earlier from the Haaretz, Professor Marandi, because it almost echoes exactly what you have said here. The damage to Houthi ports, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, and even the elimination of most of the civilian cabinet members of the Houthi, quote unquote, Houthi government still have not created deterrence. As for the diminution of capabilities, it would seem that just one drone or missile that penetrates Israeli airspace is enough to demonstrate their capabilities. Professor Marandi, given all that you said with the turning of the world against Israel, what does then the ability for Ansarullah to be able to pierce Israeli air defenses, even just a few times, although this is happening almost every single day in terms of Yemen firing into Israel, what are the lessons that it can impart to us as you said, the world situation is becoming increasingly less favorable to the Israeli regime's legitimacy?
Well, what it does is that it creates hope among people across the region. And it also reminds them of their responsibilities when the civilian cabinet, and that's an important point, by the way, the Israeli regime did not succeed in killing people in a military council or commanders in a military council. They went after civilians, people who deal with education and roads and hospitals. That's the sort of people that they massacred. But that's what the Israelis do. I mean, that's how they function. They target civilians, they target children, they slaughter ordinary people. That's what their expertise is on, and that's something that the West is fine with. I mean, I was just telling someone in the West, it really seems that these elites see Palestinians as cockroaches. That's how it is. We saw them bring down all these buildings in Gaza City, the remaining buildings, and bringing further misery among all those people who are crammed in these buildings as refugees. They just want to increase suffering. It's a monstrous regime, but they have the full support of the West. Western media will not say anything about it. But the point is that when Ansarullah continues its resistance, it enhances or strengthens or creates a sense of responsibility for everyone else who's not doing anything. When someone is making a sacrifice under such difficult circumstances, then it's difficult for others to sit back and say, I can't do anything about it, or it's too dangerous for me, or it's too much of a problem. So I think they're, and it weakens the other regime. It weakens regimes across the region, because people see that these regimes they each has their own air force and their navy and their army. They do nothing. In fact, they condemned the resistance. The United Arab Emirates condemned the attack on in Al-Quds, or in Jerusalem.
Right.
Whereas you don't see them giving out these statements every day on Gaza. I mean, if they were going to do the same for Gaza, they'd have to give a statement every 3 or 4 hours or less. But but that sort of thing it creates dissatisfaction. It creates hatred among people across the region. And we saw what happened during the so-called Arab Spring, or the awakening, a decade and a half ago, when when people get very angry. All it took was for some young person to burn himself alive over a local grievance, and then the government in Tunisia collapsed, and then we saw chaos across West Asia, North Africa. So the stronger the resistance, the longer the resistance lasts. I think the more vulnerable these regimes become. Those who are in the NATO camp, in the Western camp. So, and it's quite extraordinary that Hezbollah right now, it's surrounded. Jolani and his Al Qaeda and ISIS people, terrorists, they are putting pressure on from the east. The American proxies in Lebanon are putting pressure on Hezbollah, and then the Israeli regime bombs them from the south. Yet but they remain there. They remain steadfast. In Gaza, we saw that 4 Israeli regime soldiers were confirmed killed, and that shows that after 2 years, the resistance is alive. And Yemen, of course, has struck success. So the longer this lasts, the more hated the regime becomes, and that hatred becomes cemented across the world. And it also shows its vulnerability the longer the world lasts. And it makes regimes that do business and trade, and that have embassies in our region, more vulnerable.
I wanted to read another passage from another excerpt from this article, Professor Marandi, because I think it really demonstrates the kind of misinformation about this situation overall, but in particular when it comes to how Yemen is fighting back and being in solidarity with the people of Gaza. It says, in response to why Yemen has not been deterred, it says, it is not a war between two militaries striving to defeat each other in a defined geographic area. It's not a war against the quote-unquote proxy, such as in Iraq or Hezbollah in Lebanon. And then it says they are Ansarullah.
Of course, they're not proxies
exactly,
either.
Exactly. That's how. This is the kind of misinformation. And then it says they're presenting themselves as working on behalf of their brothers in the Gaza Strip, and making their attacks conditional on a ceasefire, but they are an independent national entity, correct, who are collecting dividends for themselves as the war continues. And it talks about how they are doing these actions to build up popular support so they can collect taxes and collect money in order to strengthen their rule in Yemen. I mean, Professor Marandi, this is the kind of presentation that, despite the factual basis of this piece, talking about how Israel has indeed been left alone against Yemen because the United States couldn't beat them, UAE couldn't beat them, Saudi Arabia couldn't beat them, and they don't want the smoke anymore. But Here you see again the spokespeople out of Tel Aviv trying to spin this toward the demonization of Ansar Allah. What's your reaction to this?
Well, there are two things here. One is that basically they're acknowledging that if you struggle against the Israeli regime, if you stand with the people of Gaza, then you become popular, right? You become more legitimate. You can get taxes. In other words, people turn to you. People see you as legitimate. People want to see you in power. And I'm sure that that's not just the case in Yemen. That's the case across the Arab world. That's the case in Turkey. That's in Turkey. They are not happy with the Erdogan and his cooperation with the Israeli regime. That's the situation in the United Arab Emirates. Public opinion is very much against what the regime there is doing. That's the mood across the region and across and beyond. So even if it's simply to gain legitimacy or to gain popular support, they're acknowledging that the way to do it is to oppose the genocide and to support the people of Gaza. But that's the exact opposite of what everyone else is doing. The second is that it doesn't really make sense. It's not logical. If, Danny, imagine Iran or Ansarullah or Hezbollah, if they wanted to do a deal with the Israeli regime and the Americans, do you think that the Americans and the West would not offer them much more than these poor taxpayers in Yemen, these impoverished taxpayers in Yemen would? They'd give them the world just to leave the Israeli regime alone and let them finish off the Palestinian children, exterminate the Palestinian children, look away, protest, carry out a few protests on your streets every now and then, condemn the regime like some of these other, there's some of these hypocrites do, and they do business and trade with Netanyahu, and they have the Israeli flag flying over their capital. But they don't do that. They don't do deals with the West. They're risking their future. They're risking their children. Iran is sanctioned, heavily sanctioned, maximum pressure sanctions, and it's simultaneously helping the Axis. Hezbollah's giving martyrs. Even during the past few days, they've given a number of martyrs. It's not in the media because the Western media ignores it. And then we saw in what happened in Syria. Some of the friends on some of the people who I know who've been on the Qatari payroll for years or on Erdogan's payroll, or Western governments had been paying them for years, those who are based in the United States and some of these so-called Muslim organizations. They went along with what we saw in Syria. They destroyed the country. Now the Syrian regime, they are doing exactly what we all said they were going to do from day one, that they were going to try to do a deal with the Israeli regime. And apparently the foreign minister of the Jolani regime is going to speak to an Israeli minister. They do their deals, but Hezbollah, Ansarullah, and the resistance, the axis of resistance, they don't do deals.
Contrary to what Haaretz is saying about Ansar Allah, this is not something you can really fake. This happens almost every single day in Yemen. Of course, these are huge when Israel strikes Yemen, but they happen all of the time in solidarity with Gaza. This is something that you can't really fake. So your final reaction to this, because I think a lot of times this is portrayed as, well, there's this so-called proxy group that's operating on its own, and as we said before, operating to wield popular power. But it seems like Ansar Allah has popular support already, if those images we see circulating almost every other day are a testament to this.
So the entire Arab world, the regimes, are working against them. Oil and gas rich dictatorships in the Persian Gulf region are funding groups that are opposed to them. The West has been bombing them, sanctioning them. The Israelis have been bombing them. The media is not supportive of them. We saw how when the Americans were bombing them, air bases in the Persian Gulf region were used to help the airstrikes. Yet they have this sort of popular support in Yemen. How can a country that has been so badly battered be able to withstand this overwhelming force, money, mercenaries, propaganda, and military, yet not only remain on their feet and maintain a government in the capital, but also lead the struggle to end the genocide in Gaza by imposing a siege on Israeli ports and by striking Israeli assets? That just shows how popular they are. That shows the height of legitimacy. Those people on the streets, and these, remember, this is an impoverished country. I mean,
Very much so.
great respect to the people of Australia and Japan and across Europe who come to the streets in huge numbers. You know, they're doing extraordinary work. But these people, they're so impoverished that I would imagine that they would have to be spending that day finding money to sustain their families,
Right.
rather than going to a square to spend a few hours protesting against the genocide. This just shows how extraordinary the people of Yemen are, and how admirable the work of the Yemeni government and Ansarullah is.